What if everything you were taught about the start of World War II was just the tip of the iceberg? Most people think it all began with Hitler rolling into Poland. But by then, the fire was already raging, and the match had been lit years earlier by broken promises, bankrupt dreams, and the loud silence of good people doing nothing. The real origin of World War II isn't just found in tanks or treaties, it's found in desperation, in fear, in the quiet rise of ideas no one thought dangerous until it was too late. This isn't your typical history lesson. We're not here to memorize dates or repeat classroom cliches. We're diving into the untold stories, letters written before death, visions of peace crushed in backroom deals, and the haunting truth that tyranny doesn't kick down the door. It waits for it to be left open. And what's most terrifying, some of the same patterns that led to global war didn't vanish with Hitler's bunker. They're still echoing in headlines today. So buckle up, because once you see what really led to World War II, you'll never look at history or the present the same way again. They say a man shows his truest self when he writes his last words. Picture this: an Italian soldier alone on a cold night, scribbling a letter to his mother by candlelight. His handwriting trembles, but not from fear, from the weight of knowing it may be the last thing she ever reads from him. And still, it's not bitterness he leaves behind, it's love. That kind of love, that silent courage, doesn't get carved into monuments, but it lingers forever. See, when we think of World War II, we often imagine tanks, generals and flags waving in black and white. Footage. But at its core, war is heartbreak in motion. It's the trembling voice of a son saying goodbye. It's the question that haunts every soldier. Will anyone remember why we bled? That letter becomes more than ink on paper. It's the soul of a generation caught between duty and despair. The thing is, he didn't ask for glory. He didn't want statues. What he really wanted: to go home, to laugh at his sister's jokes, to kiss his fiancée at the train station again. But World War II didn't deal in dreams. It demanded sacrifice. And sometimes the price was everything. Paid in silence, paid alone, paid far from anyone who could say thank you. It's easy to skim past a soldier's letter in a dusty museum archive. But if you slow down, if you really read it, you'll feel the weight of humanity on every line. That Italian soldier didn't die for politics or power. He died because his leaders failed, because promises were broken, because one war didn't really end before the next one began. That's what we need to understand before we talk about heroes, and that leads us to a man who, for better or worse, changed the course of history, not alone, but by walking into a vacuum left by the world's silence. Let's clear something up right away. Hitler didn't just appear out of thin air like some twisted magician. He was the product of a world that was already bleeding. After World War I, Europe wasn't just tired, it was broken. Economies were shattered, faith in leadership was gone, and the average citizen felt like a pawn in someone else's cruel game. That vacuum of trust, it was the perfect storm. And Hitler, he knew how to dance in a storm. You see, people didn't vote for tyranny with fangs and fire. They voted for a promise. A man who told them, "You've been humiliated, but I'll make you proud again." And pride is a dangerous thing when it's built on pain. Germany wasn't just angry. It was starving, humiliated, disoriented. They needed a lifeline. Hitler offered one. Poisoned, yes, but wrapped in confidence, certainty, and the illusion of control. Most folks imagine dictators as men who seize power by brute force. But the truth about World War II is that Hitler was invited to power by a system desperate for order. He didn't invent nationalism. He didn't create anti-Semitism. He weaponized them. The chaos that followed World War I wasn't just fertile soil for fascism. It was practically begging for a farmer with a vision, however twisted it may have been. And here's the uncomfortable part. He didn't do it alone. It wasn't just speeches in beer halls. It was judges who looked the other way. businessmen who funded the dream, citizens who stayed silent until silence became complicity. World War II wasn't born from one man's madness. It was born from a collective collapse of responsibility, a kind of sleepwalking toward disaster. And yet, decades before Hitler stepped on a podium, there was another man with a vision, a man who thought peace could be planted through promises. His name was Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson wasn't your typical power-hungry leader. He was more like the idealistic professor who believed words could mend broken bones. After World War I, he looked at the mess and thought, let's not just punish, let's prevent. He dreamed of a world where countries would talk before they fired, where small nations mattered, and where peace wasn't just a ceasefire, but a shared goal. Noble, absolutely. Naive, tragically so. At the Paris Peace Conference, Wilson walked in with his famous 14 points, like a man carrying a blueprint for heaven. But politics doesn't run on blueprints, it runs on power. Britain and France weren't interested in healing Germany, they wanted payback. They saw Wilson's ideals like window dressing on a house they were already gutting. And just like that, peace turned into punishment. The seeds of World War II were already falling from the table. Imagine promising the world fairness, then sitting at a table where fairness gets traded for revenge. That's what happened. Wilson spoke of self-determination, but colonized nations were ignored. He envisioned unity, but left the conference heartbroken. His dream of a League of Nations, something meant to stop the next global fire, was born in a room filled with smoke and old grudges. That contradiction poisoned everything that followed. And here's the kicker, it wasn't just about borders or treaties, it was about trust. Millions believed Wilson's words. Small countries thought they finally had a voice. But when the ink dried, it was clear. Winners wrote the rules and losers paid the bill. Justice wasn't blind. She was just conveniently looking away. And once that trust shattered, the world didn't just lose a war, it lost the belief that peace was even possible. That betrayal cracked open the door for resentment, and that resentment found its most brutal expression in a single piece of paper sealed in Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles wasn't just a document, it was a slap across the face of a wounded nation. Germany walked into the hall thinking there'd be some kind of dialogue. Instead, they were told to sit down, shut up and sign, disarmed, dismembered, drowned in debt. It wasn't a peace treaty, it was a punishment parade. The message was clear. You started the fire, now you'll live in the ashes. Sure, some. Historians will tell you it wasn't as cruel as older peace deals in European history, and technically they're right. But context is everything. The German people had been told by Wilson himself that peace would be fair. When those promises dissolved into humiliation, the bitterness wasn't just political, it was personal. World War II didn't come out of nowhere. It was born from broken expectations and national shame. And let's talk numbers. 132 billion gold marks in reparations. That's not just money. That's generations being told their only value is to repay a war they barely understood. Land lost, colonies stripped. Even their army was neutered down to a shadow. Imagine being a proud people told they can't even defend their own borders. The humiliation wasn't just visible, it was tattooed into their national psyche. This wasn't just about economics, it was identity theft. Germany wasn't just forced to pay, it was forced to accept total guilt. Article 231, the War Guilt Clause, basically said, this was all your fault. And when a proud country is forced to bow that low, don't be surprised if the next leader promises to make them stand taller than ever. That wound didn't heal. It festered quietly, steadily, and while the world hoped a new league would rise to stop the next disaster, that very league was already crippled right from the start. The League of Nations was supposed to be the world's referee, blowing the whistle before the next punch got thrown. Wilson believed in it with all his heart. He campaigned for it. So hard, he practically collapsed from exhaustion. But back home in the US, the Senate looked at that global dream and said, no thanks. They didn't want to be dragged into someone else's mess again. And just like that, the League was born missing its spine. Imagine creating a security system for your neighborhood, but the guy who designed it refuses to install it in his own house. That's what it felt like. The United States, fresh off of victory and full of potential, stayed on the sidelines. And without Uncle Sam's muscle, the League wasn't feared. It was pitied. Sure, the other countries joined, but everyone knew the bouncer didn't show up to the club. Now, the idea itself wasn't bad. In fact, it was ahead of its time. Diplomacy over war, unity over division. But what's a vision without teeth? When Japan invaded Manchuria or Italy started poking around in Ethiopia, the League wagged its finger. And that was about it. No consequences, no real bite. And the bullies of the world, they noticed. They always notice when no one's watching the playground. It's painful to admit, but World War II grew in the cracks left behind by the League's failure. It wasn't that people didn't want peace. It's that peace without accountability is just a suggestion. The League lacked credibility, power, and most importantly, commitment. You can't stop a storm with paper promises, no matter how noble they sound in Geneva. And with the world's moderates asleep at the wheel, something dangerous crept in from both ends of the spectrum. Something loud, radical, and ready to burn the center to the ground. When the middle fails, the extremes throw a party. After World War I, people didn't just lose faith in governments, they lost faith in moderation itself. The polite, reasonable voices, they got drowned out by shouting. On one side, you had communists waving red flags and promising to flip the whole system. On the other, fascists beating drums and promising to bring back order with clenched fists. It was less politics, more tug-of-war on fire. Now let's be honest, this wasn't some academic debate between ideologies. This was survival. Jobs were gone. Savings evaporated. People weren't choosing between left and right, they were choosing between desperation and more desperation. And when you're broken, the loudest voice feels like the clearest path. That's how World War II crept in, not through logic, but through chaos wearing conviction like armor. Moscow lit the flame first. The Bolsheviks turned revolution into reality, and for the poor and angry across Europe, it was intoxicating. But for conservatives and elites, it was terrifying. Enter the fascists, Italy being the early laboratory. Mussolini didn't just oppose the left, he promised to crush it. And in a world terrified of red revolutions, many were more than happy to hand him the hammer. And here's the wild twist. These two extremes fed off each other. The communists needed the threat of fascism to justify their methods. The fascists needed the fear of communism to grow their ranks. It was a sick cycle. The center, it had no anthem, no fire, no fists, just the worn-out hope that reason might one day make a comeback. But history doesn't wait for moderation. And in Italy, a man with a jaw like stone and eyes full of fire was already marching through the streets with black shirts and brutal dreams. Italy walked out of World War I feeling like the kid who showed up to the party but got ignored. They were on the winning side, sure, but they didn't feel like winners. Promises made during the war weren't kept. Economic despair hit hard, unemployment soared, and the people were fed up with a government that seemed more like a debating club than a lifeline. That's when Mussolini stepped in and said, "Enough talk, time for action." And boy, did he mean action. Mussolini didn't wait for ballots, he brought boots. His black shirts weren't just a fashion statement, they were street thugs dressed as saviors. They beat up communists, silenced critics, and made violence feel like patriotism. For a country craving order, even a boot on the neck felt better than chaos. And so, fascism didn't sneak in. It marched in, flags waving, drums pounding. He promised to restore Roman glory, to make Italy feared and respected. But the price was steep. Free speech, gone. Political opponents, crushed. The press, muzzled. And the people, well, some cheered, others whispered. Most stayed quiet, hoping the trains would keep running on time. Fascism was marketed as strength, but beneath the surface, it was just fear with better branding. Here's the twisted part. Mussolini didn't hide what he was. He screamed it through megaphones. He wore it like a badge. And yet, people followed. Not because they were blind, but because they were tired. Tired of waiting. Tired of losing, tired of democracy that never seemed to deliver, and in that exhaustion they gave away their rights for the illusion of revival. World War II would later cash that check in blood, but Italy wasn't the only country in agony. Across the Alps, Germany was drowning in a storm of its own, a storm made of poverty, betrayal, and rage. Germany after World War I wasn't just wounded, it was in free fall. Picture this. One day your paycheck buys groceries, the next it barely buys a loaf of bread. Hyperinflation turned savings into confetti. Families burned cash for warmth because it was cheaper than firewood. That's not an economy, that's a national nervous breakdown. And in that madness, trust in the new democratic Weimar Republic evaporated faster than ink on worthless money. It wasn't just economic, it was emotional. The German people were told they lost the war, not on the battlefield, but because of betrayal back home. The stab-in-the-back myth blamed Jews, communists, and leftist politicians for Germany's defeat. An ugly lie, but one that gave people a scapegoat. After all, it's easier to blame a traitor than to face defeat. And that lie, it became the fuel that would later ignite a very real fire. Meanwhile, the government looked clueless. Political parties bickered, coups came and went, and extremist voices sounded more confident by the day. The average German didn't want philosophy. They wanted food, pride, stability. And the loudest voices offering that weren't moderates. They were radicals, often with clenched fists and a taste for violence. World War II didn't start with tanks. It started with broken trust and empty bellies. What made it worse? The humiliation wasn't ancient history, it was daily life. Soldiers from the war were begging on the streets. National pride was in tatters. And democracy, that shining experiment, looked more like a circus of finger-pointing and failure. In a time like that, when dignity feels like a distant memory, people don't vote for reason. They vote for resurrection, even if it comes wrapped in rage. And in that desperate search for resurrection, one man rose from the beer halls of Munich. With big dreams, brutal methods, and an eye on power. Hitler wasn't born a mastermind, but he learned fast. At first, he tried to copy Mussolini's playbook to the letter. In 1923, he staged the beer hall putsch, a dramatic little coup that flopped so hard it landed him in jail. But here's the twist. Prison didn't break him, it trained him. That's where he realized something critical. If you want to take down a democracy, don't attack it. Use it, smile, shake hands, then burn it from the inside. So he changed tactics. Out went the brute force. In came suits, speeches, and sly strategy. Hitler began charming microphones and manipulating crowds like a conductor with a symphony. Of pain, fear, and pride, his oratory was electric. He didn't just speak to people, he channeled them, their frustrations, their anger, their longing to belong. That wasn't politics, that was emotional possession. And let's not forget the brown shirts, the SA. While Hitler made speeches, they made noise in the streets, beatings, intimidation, clashes with communists. They created the chaos that made Hitler look like the only man who could restore order. It was all part of the plan. Break the system, then offer yourself as the fix. That's how World War II took shape, not through stealth, but through spectacle. People think tyrants sneak in, but Hitler didn't hide. He walked through the front door with voters holding it open. The Nazis exploited every democratic tool, ballots, rallies, coalitions. And once inside, they twisted the law until it served one man's will. The game wasn't rigged at first. It was just played better by someone who didn't care if he broke the board afterward. And once the board was his, Hitler began telling the German people they weren't just victims, they were destined for something far greater, a dream of space, of blood, of soil, and of a purified future waiting just beyond the borders. Once Hitler had the mic, he didn't just sell policies, he sold a myth of greatness lost, of land stolen, of destiny unfulfilled. Lebensraum, living space, became the rallying cry. Germany, he claimed, was suffocating, not because of economics or poor planning, but because of betrayal, because the true German spirit had been strangled by outsiders and weaklings. And what's the fix? Expand, conquer, purify. He dressed nationalism in romance, fields of golden grain, strong, families and ancient roots in the soil. It was like a bedtime story wrapped in blood. The Germans weren't just a people, they were a chosen people. And anyone who didn't fit that vision, they weren't just different, they were enemies, Jews, Slavs, communists, liberals, anyone who challenged the myth became part of the problem. It wasn't new hatred, it was old hatred, rebranded with banners and slogans. What made it lethal was the delivery. Hitler didn't scream chaos, he whispered belonging. He offered identity to the broken, a home to the displaced. And that kind of message, man, it sticks, especially when wrapped in uniforms, songs, and a promise that the world would bow once more to the German Reich. And here's the really dark genius. He didn't start by killing. He started by redefining what it meant to be German, redefining loyalty, redefining truth. By the time most people realized what was happening, their neighbors were being deported. The press was silent, and their sons were wearing swastikas. World War II wasn't just a war of tanks. It was a war of stories weaponized by fear. And now, as we look back on how it all began, not just the battles, but the beliefs, we see that the spark wasn't one moment. It was 1,000 little choices, stacked like kindling, waiting for a match. So now that you've seen the real chain of events that led to World War II, the betrayals, the forgotten voices, the rise of extremes, ask yourself, what story are we living through today? What signs are we ignoring? What harmless ideas are quietly gaining ground because they're easier to accept than the truth? History doesn't repeat, it whispers. And those whispers can become screams if we're not paying attention. Every choice matters, every silence matters. World War II didn't begin with bombs, it began with beliefs. And the only way to stop history from rhyming again is to stay awake, fully awake. So what will you do with this knowledge? If you found this valuable, if it stirred something in you, go ahead and subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. This is just the beginning. There's so much more beneath the surface, and together we're going to uncover it.